I'd never taken a train in the US before, especially not on an extensive trip, so this was a first for me. This trip wasn't my own idea, I was merely tagging along on someone else's work trip, but when I'm invited to travel, especially to places that I've never been before, I find it near impossible to decline. We began in Denver for our first and longest ride, a 19-hour train ride to Chicago. Most of it was overnight, so I got the sleep that I could, and then the next morning sat in the observation car for a while. Being that I had nothing but time, and this was a new beginning and a new trip, it was kind of the perfect time to begin my new sketchbook. I was also crossing my fingers that I could add to my obscure museum pin collection that I started on my camera bag, somewhere and sometime along this trip. When we finally arrived in Chicago, there was a lot to see and so little time, so we got caffeinated and then strolled the Legacy Walk. It was lined with plaques of LGBTQ people who paved the way in so many avenues. It was on our way to the Unabridged bookstore, an LGBTQ-focused shop that opened in the 1980s when queer-focused bookshops weren't exactly common. It had the largest queer section I've ever seen in a bookshop, and even had so many other obscure books that I've only been able to find after a little bit of digging online. So, spoiler, this was my favorite bookstore this whole entire trip. And my only regret from this trip was not buying something from there. That's what I get for trying to have self-control, I guess. But I will be purchasing something from them online. Then we walked a little more and wandered the AIDS Garden, which I wish there were more memorials and information than just this QR code and this sign, but being at the water and seeing the city skyline did make it a really nice way to spend the afternoon. The next day, after caffeinating at another local cafe, taking a little bit of time to read and draw, I had some time to visit Rose Hill Cemetery, which had been recommended to me by some of you. Great suggestion, by the way. This cemetery was apparently the first burial site in the city for people who were lost to HIV in the mid-1980s. Lastly, we stopped at the Leather Archives, the only museum dedicated to leather, kink, and fetish history. museum was so much more expansive than I was expecting. This info on Mistress Murr was one of my favorites because she had this quote that said something along the lines of, "Yes, I sodomized men, which was illegal, but in my dungeon, I am the law." That's pretty badass if you ask me. I learned so much queer history, and they even had a whole library of queer archives that you're free to browse and read. And one for the collection. We only got a quick peek at downtown because our next train was super early, and we headed to Cleveland. Truthfully, we didn't even really get a full day here. However, we did manage to stop by Erie Street Cemetery, a very small cemetery in the middle of Cleveland, full of settlers and some Native American chiefs, who, notably, were the only headstones with any offerings. I wish I had time to see Lakeview Cemetery like so many of you suggested, but that will have to be for a later time. We also did stop by Book Brothers fairly quickly, a used bookshop linked on that collaborative worldwide bookstore map, where you can either add your own favorite local bookstores or find any bookstores near you while you're traveling. More information on that in the description. Then it was off to Buffalo. Honestly, we weren't really sure where to start in Buffalo, and I was getting a little unsettled by the stark lack of people on the streets for a Saturday afternoon. We popped by Fitt's Books and Waffles, which was a cozy little used bookshop whose owner also sells waffles, ice cream, and coffee. After we stumbled upon this flyer for a queer arts festival that just so happened to be that day. Perfect. It was so much more lively there, and I even ran into two of you. Unfortunately, for some reason, I lost all the footage that I personally took during this arts festival, including the footage of some of you who came up to me and made a little cameo, which really sucks. So if you're ever in Denver, definitely flag me down, we'll remake that. But I do have the footage that the person that I was with took, so here's a little bit of that. One thing we did make it to was Mary Shelley, a horror-themed bar for readers. Unfortunately, that footage is also gone, so just check it out if you ever find yourself in Buffalo. Then our very early train ride to Boston, where once again we had to hit a bookstore. The first one was one of the oldest bookstores in the US, Brattle Bookshop. The outside section was a sight for sore eyes. It's a huge used bookstore with 3 stories. The top section, all rare and antique books. The second bookshop we hit was Commonwealth Books, much smaller but still dense in selection. We did a little bit more wandering and grabbed lunch before we headed to our last stop, Salem. I have a confession. Salem has never been a bucket list place for me, which people are always shocked to hear. Honestly, it's always just sounded like Hollywood, but for witches. Touristy and more theatrical than realistic or educational. I didn't really want to see the capitalization on tragic deaths of people at the hands of hysteria and religion, and truth be told, the main strip of Salem kind of felt that way with some of the museums and shops. I found there was actually a lot of charm to Salem. First, we visited a pirate museum, fully expecting it to be cheesy, but ended up getting a whole history of a very niche shipwreck. Unfortunately, there were no pins in the gift shop. The place we were staying was central, across the street from a museum that we totally missed, and the first church ever built in Salem. I found it incredibly satisfying that the first church built by the Puritans, and was no doubt a place that once pushed out the odd and different, is now a primarily LGBTQ church. That right there was the real charm of Salem, for me, I think. It was that a settlement built on fear of people who were different, built by the people who were oppressive and wanting to create what they thought was a sanctuary away from the people who they had othered. But now this city is the very city that is not only run by, but known to hold the misfits, the different, the weirdos, and the witches. It's now one of the witchiest cities in the US, and for me, that irony is delicious. And on brand, we ended our trip with a last visit to perhaps the most beautiful cemetery I have ever visited in the US, Harmony Grove Cemetery. This was a very fast-paced trip, and while I so wish I could have lingered longer in each place, really being able to soak in what each city was really like and had to teach me, I'm happy to say that I've finally been fully from the West Coast, Midwest, to the East Coast. The US is big, and that's a pretty difficult accomplishment. At least it was for me. That's all for this one. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, may your gods treat you as you've treated others. And remember, live curiously. You never know what you might find.